When Nephi says that the brass plates he carried contained the five books of Moses, most Latter-day Saints don't think twice about it. But in modern biblical scholarship, that's actually a huge claim. Many scholars argue that the Torah, or the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, wasn't completed until long after Lehi supposedly left Jerusalem. So here's the question. If the Torah didn't exist in anything like its current form by 600 BC, what exactly was on those brass plates? And if it did exist, even in a substantial early form, why do so many scholars disagree about when it was written? Today, I'm joined by Neal Rappleye of Informed Saints and the Ancient America Foundation to discuss his paper published in FAIR's recent volume, Open Thou Mine Eyes. We're going to take a look at the current field of biblical studies and ask a grounded, honest question. Does the Book of Mormon collapse under modern scholarship? Is the dating of the Torah too late for Nephi's brass plates? Or does it hold up better than most people realize? This is a very interesting topic. I like diving into Pentateuchal source criticism, probably more than your average Latter-day Saint, at least.
Probably more than I do.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, and we're going to talk all about your paper here as we get going in a minute. But just reading your paper, this is not an easy topic to tackle.
No, not at all.
There's a very rich history of scholarship behind the Pentateuch and its source criticism. And it's not something that you just kind of jump into overnight and get a strong sense of the landscape.
Right.
Um, so your paper to me reads like you spent a significant amount of time really diving into this subject matter and surveying the land, so to speak.
Yeah.
Um, and so I appreciate that. And I felt like your paper was um, thorough without being necessarily exhaustive.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a very strong overview of the field, and obviously with the added benefit of um, how it relates to the Book of Mormon in particular.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Because like one of my points of frustration, and part of the reason I wrote the paper, maybe this could be actual something we actually talk about again on the podcast, but I don't know.
You
Maybe
know
I don't
what?
want to
Why?
say this
Let's just
publicly.
start right now, and we can get into it. Um, I'll keep this part in. Let's just start here, Neal. A lot of Latter-day Saints are going to open up the Book of Mormon. They're going to read in the early chapters of First Nephi that there's these brass plates that Nephi retrieves, and they contain on them the five books of Moses. Most Latter-day Saints are not even going to bat an eye at that. It's not going to make any difference whatsoever to them. That just fits naturally with our modern conception of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, where these things come from.
Yeah.
So that's this is actually an interesting claim that the Book of Mormon is making, or that Nephi is making in these early chapters. So, yeah, why don't we dive right into what was the impetus for writing this paper? What was some of the frustrations that you were having that led you kind of on this journey?
Yeah. So, like you said, for most Latter-day Saints, the idea that the five books of Moses are on the brass plates, they're not even going to bat an eye on that because they're the five books of Moses, and Moses was before Nephi, and so of course those books can be on the brass plates. Um, the problem you run into is that it's the view in biblical studies for literally hundreds of years now has been that Moses did not actually write the five books of Moses. And there's a lot of good reasons to believe that's correct, um, at least in terms of putting pen to paper and actually composing this literature. We can maybe get into what extent there might be a historical Moses figure that could have influenced or been the impetus or originator of some of this material in some way, shape, or form. But that's really not the point of my paper. The problem though is, like I said, Moses isn't really thought to be the author of this material, and your stand this kind of the standard explanation and dating of the material that we now have and know as the five books of Moses, or the Torah in Hebrew, or Pentateuch as it's often called in biblical studies, which is the Greek for five books. Um, the problem is it's believed to have been something that developed over a long time, and most scholars would place the final culminating development of it into something resembling the Torah or the five books after 600 BC, right? And in fact, that a lot of scholars would suggest that lots of the material itself wasn't even written until after 600 BC. Um, and there's debate about all of that, which we might end up getting into. We'll see. Um, this is something that I kind of felt like had not really been adequately addressed um, in by Latter-day Saints in kind of the Book of Mormon. I mean, you can call it Book of Mormon apologetics, Book of Mormon scholarship, pro historicity scholarship, or whatever you might call it. I didn't feel like it had really been adequately addressed at a very robust level of detail. Engagement with the literature on Pentateuchal source criticism and stuff like that was always kind of superficial. It felt like, and so even though I don't consider myself much of a source critic, in fact, I'm not a source critic at all. I decided to kind of dive in and tackle this because it comes up. It's maybe not the biggest issue that people have necessarily, but it comes up a lot. There was a period of a few years where I swear there was one guy, and we won't name him or call him out, but there was one guy who would show up in the comments of literally everything pro Book of Mormon and talk about how, well, the brass plates can't have the five books of Moses on it, and there's all these problems with Genesis and Exodus and all this stuff. And so I just finally decided I was gonna dive in, and it was kind of the outgrowth of a different project that I was doing, and I initially wasn't really gonna address what could or couldn't be on the brass plates as part of that project, but it kept nagging at me, so I just decided I'd do it.
Yeah, it's not the most immediate question or concern that a lot of people will have with the Book of Mormon. Certainly not as much as like metalworking or horses or other things that seem to be anachronistic to the Book of Mormon. Those
Right.
are kind of the, I don't know if you want to call them low hanging fruit, but those are the very common arguments levied against any historicity of the Book of Mormon. And so this is kind of one of those that creeps in from time to time. I have seen this, and maybe I've even seen it from the person that you're talking about. I'm sure he's still around somewhere, just shaking his fist at Joseph Smith and whatnot. But yeah, so this is not that common of an issue, and yet at the same time, it feels like there's quite a bit riding on this in some regard.
Sure.
Um, so maybe for those who are not familiar at all with what we call biblical or Pentateuchal source criticism, the study of the origins of where these texts that we call the Pentateuch or the Torah, where they come from, who wrote them, and so forth. Um, for those who aren't very familiar with this broad field of study, um, what are some of like the major distinct sort of hypotheses that seem to be more, at least more prevalent in the scholarship currently?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a rich history of this, but if someone's going to just kind of dip their toe in, so to speak, and see what does the landscape look like at the moment, what are some of those main theories?
Yeah. To start off with, I guess I'll just explain like source criticism is kind of this discipline or this idea where you can scrutinize the text of, and it's not something that's unique to biblical studies. Pretty much any historical discipline is going to involve some kind of source criticism where you're trying to scrutinize the source material that something is based on and determine, hey, is this credible and reliable? And that is kind of the origins of the source critical endeavor, is it was people like Julius Wellhausen and stuff, they were trying to write a history of Israel. And in order to do that, they were trying to they were trying to scrutinize the source material to see, when does it date to, how reliable is it historically, things like that. Um, and it's really kind of now it's source criticism in the biblical field is not as closely connected to historicity and historical writing per se. It's obviously still relevant to it, um, but yeah, it's this idea that you can read these texts and scrutinize them really carefully and look for different things where there are maybe narrative inconsistencies, shifts in voice, repetitious material that is kind of, it seems like it's unnecessarily repeating things and whatnot. There's various kinds of little things that they look for where they say, okay, this looks like there's a source here or a different source or a shift in sources and things like that. And then kind of from there, they kind of pick apart the text and say, okay, this material came from one source and this material came from another. And for a long time, kind of the dominating or the overriding theory on the Pentateuch at least was what's known as the documentary hypothesis. And this was basically the theory that really all of the material in the Pentateuch, or most of it at least, could be attributed to four specific sources, which kind of three of which kind of carried the narrative or uh, encompassed more or less the same narrative through the entire Pentateuch, written by three different authors at different times, and then being kind of interwoven together at a later point. And so the four sources were, you know, they would be referred to as like J for the Yahwist, which, Wellhausen is German, and so he writes Yahwist with a J. And so we've got J. If it's easier for you to remember, instead of Yahwist, it can be Jehovah, right? That's where we get the name Jehovah, is Yahweh, Jehovah. Um, and it's named basically because that source predominantly uses the name Jehovah or Yahweh for the name of the principal deity, right? So the God of Israel. So that there's that source, and historically, in this classical model, that was believed to be the earliest source, and it was dated to, some would say as early as the 10th century BC, but maybe 10th or 9th century BC, kind of date range there. And then the next source is called the Elohist or E source, and that's because it predominantly used Elohim or El type names for God, at least up until Moses' encounter on Mount Sinai, where the Lord's name is revealed to him. Um, and then uh, and then the next source is there's D for Deuteronomy. Um, and then there's the priestly source, which will be referred to as P lots of times, right? And um, for our interest in the Book of Mormon necessarily, the traditional dates, at least for J, E, and D, really don't give us a lot of heartburn. Like I said, J is often thought to be as early as the 10th or 9th century BC, and then E is often almost as early, 9th or 8th century BC. Um, More recent scholarship would maybe push those, at least some scholars. There's, we can get into the fact that there are other scholars that do argue for pretty early dates still for a lot of material. But, in more recent times, some scholars have dated that stuff even later. But even a lot of scholars today would still support either a 7th or 8th century date for a lot of that material. And then D, Deuteronomy, pretty strong. I don't want to say consensus because you can always find someone who doesn't agree with this,
Right.
but pretty widely held that that's the book of the law in 2 Kings 23, or is it 2 Kings 22 when that's
I think
brought
it's
up?
I think it's 22. This is
Yeah,
a reference to King Josiah, and during
yeah,
his early part of his reign, they find the Book of the Law in the temple as they're sort of renovating.
yeah. So yeah, lots of pretty widely held in biblical scholarship that that is the book of Deuteronomy. Now, you'll get maybe some debate as to whether the book of Deuteronomy is actually a forgery that's being written at that time, or is it based on some earlier source material. and it's just discovered at that time. But regardless of which model you favor at the moment, the point is it exists in the 7th century BC. So again, generally not a problem for us. It's usually when you get to the priestly source, in this kind of traditional model at least, that we start to have a problem for the Book of Mormon, because Wellhausen and a lot of scholars since then have dated this priestly material to either the exile or after the exile, right? And so it's too late to be on the brass plates. And the real rubber hits the road there, because then the composition of those sources into the Pentateuch or the Torah itself has to take place even later, right? It can't take place until the priestly source is written. It's kind of the traditional, from what I'm recalling, at least off the top of my head, the traditional view is kind of that, like around the time of Ezra, right? You finally have all of this source material exists and it's put together, and you have this idea that there is this Torah of Moses and it's these 5 books. And so that's about 150 to 200 years too late for Nephi to have that on the brass plates. And that's really kind of the problem, I guess, if you will, for the Book of Mormon in that respect.
So we have sort of the Wellhausen and that school of thought with the very early stages of the documentary hypothesis. That's obviously evolved over time. It's been, I don't know, what, 150-ish years since
Yeah,
then. And
yeah,
so
sure.
scholars have come a long way since then, but we see even today, like folks like Joel Baden and others who write extensively about a neo
Yeah,
documentary hypothesis and sort of updating that. And then we see others in the field who have slightly different take on the dating of certain texts, or what we call layers. You mentioned like Yahwist, Elohist, the priestly, and the Deuteronomic writings as kind of like different layers of the Pentateuch that are woven
yeah,
together to become what would eventually be called the 5 books of Moses.
yeah.
Um, but we have these different layers, and I'm wondering if before we get any further, you mentioned some of the things that scholars are looking at when they're trying to differentiate between the layers. They look for particular characteristics. You mentioned one, which I think is fascinating, which is the difference between something like the priestly or Elohist accounts that use Elohim almost exclusively to refer to God, whereas something like the traditional J source or Yahweh source will almost always use Yahweh or Yahweh Elohim as the moniker for God. Can you think of any other examples of like what kind of things scholars are looking for when they're actually trying to differentiate between these layers?
Yeah, I mean, I read
Not
like
to
a
like
hundred different
totally
things at
put you
one
on the
point,
spot, but
but especially like in the early 20th century, um, in kind of the immediate wake of Wellhausen and his initial like proposal of this model, you'd get kind of these long list of features or characteristics of the J source or the E source or whatever. And then those would then be used to kind of systematically address problematic passages that hadn't quite fit into one model or the other. And scholars would list all these different characteristics. And I honestly, I'm drawing a blank as to what some of those other features besides the names are. Um, I know that like for a long time, like the Elohist, all the way up to people as recently as like Richard Elliott Friedman, who uh, he still advocates for a model more or less consistent with this kind of classic Wellhausen documentary hypothesis. Um, they will often take like Friedman and others. I think again, this goes all the way back, I think, to Wellhausen himself. The Elohist is often regarded as like a northern Israelite source, and it's kind of seen as okay, the kingdoms divide, and then the people in the northern kingdom they want a competing narrative for uh, that makes all of like that makes places in their territory sacred and important, and that kind of celebrates uh, stuff that's going to be important to them as Northern Israel and doesn't have like a Judean focus, right? And so then what happens when you interpret it that way is features like stories about Jacob going to Bethel, which is in the northern kingdom, and having this sacred experience there where he sees God. You're going to say, oh, that's part of E because that's kind of sacralizing this sacred space up in northern Israel. That would not be a Judah, something that a Judahite source would do. That's something that a northern kingdom would do. And so E becomes this, you. I've even seen some scholars, kind of say, okay, J for Judah and E for Ephraim to help you remember like the southern kingdom versus northern kingdom perspective and stuff like that. So those kinds of features would come into play. These days, you mentioned like Joel Baden and the neo-documentarians. Um, One of the things that really kind of happens with the documentary hypothesis is over time it just becomes really unwieldy. You know, you present like you'll get like the textbook presentation that's more or less like what we just described earlier, like these four sources or layers, strata, whatever you want to call them. Um, but you would have scholars who are proposing lots of like sublayers and different strata or multiple authors of these different parts and these like so many like complicated stages and people would add like all kinds of other sources beyond just those main four. And it really started to get kind of unwieldy. And you get some major critiques of not only the documentary hypothesis, but the methods itself that are being used to establish it by like the 70s and 80s. I mean, there's really one of the things that I don't think is always appreciated is there's really critiques going on the whole time. There's never truly a full consensus around this idea, and there are critiques going on the whole time, and there are there's a good book called Murmuring Against Moses by a couple of Catholic scholars. I'm blanking on their names right now, but they actually they just kind of write like the counter history, the counter narrative about the history of the documentary hypothesis, where they're just like, hey, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, here are people who argued against the documentary hypothesis, and basically just show like, hey, there were scholars who were dissenting the entire time, but you really start to see like in the 70s and 80s and 90s, criticisms of the documentary hypothesis get pretty robust, and you really do see a point there where a lot of mainstream scholars, biblical scholars, kind of start to abandon it. And you can have people like Joseph Blenkinsop writing for uh, the introductory volume on the Pentateuch for the Anchor Bible Reference Library, which I don't know how familiar your audience is with biblical scholarship, but this is a major go-to reference work on the Pentateuch, and you have him basically saying, yeah, you can't assume. I wish I had the quote right in front of me, but you can no longer, oh yeah, here it is. There is no longer consensus on the existence of identifiable continuous narrative sources covering the entire range of the Pentateuch, right? And basically what he's saying is this idea of continuous J, E, and P sources running through the length of at least, Genesis through Numbers. We can't really assume that anymore. It had been so severely critiqued, and the problems with the methods had been so thoroughly identified and called out that you could no longer adhere to that. What then happens there, and where people like Joel Baden and the reason they call them neo-documentarians kind of comes into play, is um, people like Joel Baden and I think Baruch Schwartz before him, who he studied under, if I'm remembering correctly, for his PhD. Um, they kind of strip back the method to its basics. And instead of looking at like the names of God or, is it northern or southern or things like that, or does it have priestly interests, whatever the case may be, that's like ritual cultic stuff, which is priestly. That's kind of another one of the criteria that obviously just got stuff lumped into the P source all the time, right? Um, Instead of looking for that kind of stuff, they started using a method called narrative coherence, where basically their method is you read the text, and when you get to a point where there's no longer narrative coherence, there's something contradicting it, there's a repetition that can't be interpreted as a just a repeated event or something like that, that's clearly describing the same event twice or whatever, that's just not narratively consistent. There's these narrative inconsistencies. That's the point where you stop and you splice, right? You split the source up at that point, and then you continue to read for narrative coherence. And the model, the argument from people like Baden in his book Composition of the Pentateuch, um, is that when you do that, you still end up with more or less, in broad outlines. And again, you've got to speak generically here because the exact composition of a J source versus an E source versus a P source is going to vary between different scholars. But Joel Baden and others in that camp have basically argued that when you take it and you just read for narrative coherence, you end up splitting off with and end up with the same, more or less the same source divisions that you had before. And so you've got a J and an E and a P, and then you've got Deuteronomy over there. So that's kind of they've stripped back and they've scaled back from claims about the dating of the sources and things like that. Joel Baden's position in his book, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a number of years since I read it, but he kind of argues that like this is a literary hypothesis. It's not a historical hypothesis. And again, that differs from the original purpose and intent to which people like Wellhausen were even doing it in the first place. Because Wellhausen, I mean, I think his book is titled, it's in German, but the English translation would be a prolegomena to a history of Israel, right? Like
Yeah.
his whole purpose of doing it was to write a history of Israel, and to do that, you needed to know when the sources dated to, and what the sources were. But now, the position of the neo-documentarians is really more like, hey, this is a literary hypothesis. It's about the literary sources. And they also kind of take the position that it's about what you might call the penultimate stage of development for the Pentateuch. So not the very final stage where you have the Pentateuch itself, but the stage right before that. And so other, aspects of like you know, can J be split into other sources or E, or, what that material might have looked like prior to the writing of a J or an E source is not a consideration of the documentary hypothesis in this kind of neo-documentarian view. Um, Rather than overcomplicate the whole thing like that, they're saying, look, we're trying to figure out what did the material look right before it was, and then how did it get edited into the Pentateuch as we have it. And that's kind of how they argue for, again, these same four core sources. And they often strip back, people even like Richard Elliott Friedman and others had begun to argue for like multiple stages of editing along the way. And people like Joel Baden say it's more parsimonious to just assume it was all edited into one composition at one stage. There's not like a JE editor and then later you've got P being edited in and all that kind of stuff, which is what other scholars had argued up to that point. So
Yeah, and you have like you have other scholars who have some different theories as well. There's the supplementary hypothesis, which is another big theory. Maybe not quite as popular, but still fairly predominant. All that to say, it's messy.
yeah.
There's doesn't seem to be any real consensus in the field. If you were to pool all of the source critical theorists on a particular passage or set of passages and have them analyze the same narrative or the same passage, you're going to get multiple different theories or viewpoints regarding their source. And so it's not as clean as I think a lot of people would like it to be. I certainly would love it if it was just magically all solved and we knew exactly where every bit came from and who wrote it and all that stuff. Wouldn't that be something? But it's simply not the case that we can really know with any certainty uh, where all these distinctions come from. And you mentioned like with Joel Baden and his camp and others, like, yeah, this is a shift from a historical analysis to a literary analysis. I think is
Mhm.
very very clear in the kind of work that they're doing and the goals that they have. Um, and so, what does that say about the historicity, um, if anything? And so there's a lot of different questions that could be teased out. Um, But with respect to our conversation around your paper and the things that you've been putting together and studying in your research, um, maybe we can confine ourselves to those things that are maybe most immediately apparent in the field, um, and specifically how they relate to our conversation around the brass plates in the Book of Mormon. Um, you mentioned already at the top, as we kind of got going here, the big question or concern that someone might have is the dating of the Pentateuch, and does that uh, do the main layers, so to speak, of the Pentateuch date to a time period that would be plausible to be had on these brass plates and carried out of Jerusalem around 600 BC? That seems to be the real question. So,
Yeah.
um, so maybe we can dig into your paper a bit, and you can talk about um, now in the opening pages of your paper, you go through great lengths to discuss the different time periods that we're talking about, and also maybe some differences in the Hebrew language, depending upon which time period we're looking at. So, if you wouldn't mind, maybe kind of give just a 30,000 foot view of the general time periods we're looking at when we talk about the source or dating of the Pentateuch, and like what kind of things are we looking at when we're trying to see from the perspective of linguistics, which is a big portion of your paper.
Yeah.
Um, what is it that we're actually looking at here and using to differentiate between time periods?
Yeah, so in any language, you have historical development, right? And this can be seen as English speakers, you know, honestly, within our own lifetimes. I mean, I don't know how old you are, Jacob, but say
Too
within the
old.
last 30 years, too old. The last 30, 40 years, you can even see development in language just in that time, right? Just from generation to generation, right? The young whippersnappers come along with their new slang, and you're just like, what do you mean no cap? What's going on here, right? Like there's linguistic development happening like in real time in our lifetimes, but generally not to the degree that you can't understand one another anymore. But you back up a lot further, right? I mean, most readers of Scripture, most Latter-day Saint readers of Scripture especially, probably encounter some difficulty because the King James version of the Bible is English from over 400 years ago at this point, right? And so, um, that can be a difficulty that you encounter. And the Book of Mormon's language imitates that language, and it's certainly from a couple hundred years ago now as well. Um, and you go further back, right? You've got Shakespeare. You can go even further. You can go to Beowulf and whatever, and it really just starts to become totally unintelligible unless you're getting a modern translation that's updating it into modern English. Or you study that period of literature and you actually learn Old English, which even then, I think it's like you're basically translating a language, even though it's technically English, right? So languages go through this historical periodization and development, and that's true of Hebrew as well. At least the predominant model, of Hebrew linguists generally agree that there would have been that there was historical development of the Hebrew language. Certainly, modern Hebrew has its differences with biblical Hebrew. And most scholars, I won't say all scholars, because again, you get disputes about this all the time, and there's kind of a new school camp that argues against the dating and historical linguistic models. But there's still a pretty sizable and robust group of linguists who support it and defend it and believe it's important for dating biblical texts. Um, but within the biblical canon, it's generally thought that there are stages of Hebrew that can be detected. There's a very, very small corpus of material that scholars think is will label archaic biblical Hebrew, and these are a few passages here and there. Exodus 15, which is called the Song of the Sea or the Song of Miriam, sometimes. Judges 5, Deuteronomy 32. There's a few others off the top of my head. Jacob 49, I think, or at least part of it. Um, some stuff in early in First Samuel that are they're believed to be archaic Hebrew texts that come from a very early time, um, like late second millennium, early Iron Age, maybe even late Bronze Age, though I don't know that you'd find a lot of people who defend a late Bronze Age date at this point, but early Iron Age, the 1100s, maybe BC. Um, but then the bulk of material, the bulk of what you have in the Hebrew Bible, is written in a language that scholars call, because it's the bulk, because it's most of it, standard biblical Hebrew, or maybe sometimes they'll call it classical biblical Hebrew. And this is generally believed to be the Hebrew language of the ancient Israelite monarchy. So basically, from the time of David-ish, right, to the time of the Babylonian exile-ish, right, which is 586, say 1000 to 586 BC, is kind of the date range you're usually looking at when people talk about standard biblical Hebrew. Um, and then it's a little less defined, and you might get a little more debate around it, but a lot of scholars would support the idea that there is a stage of Hebrew called transitional biblical Hebrew. Um, and this is like the Book of Ezekiel, more or less, is kind of the main example of this, because it's written during the Babylonian exile. You start to see some different linguistic influence from Mesopotamia, uh, and I don't know if you see Persian in Ezekiel off the top of my head, but you start to see some features that appear to be later. And you see it in Jeremiah as well, which is, again, someone who kind of straddles the line between standard biblical Hebrew and then into the exilic period. Um, and then and then you get what's more definitively considered late biblical Hebrew. And that's like Ezra and Nehemiah, the book of Esther, Daniel. Well, Daniel's in late biblical Hebrew, but also Aramaic parts of it, right?
Yeah, a large portion of it.
So and kind of, I mean, there's a lot of technical linguistic stuff that goes into these sorts of things, and there are a lot of features that are considered late but can show up in standard biblical Hebrew. They're just not as frequent. And so there's certain things that just become more common. But like the real stuff that kind of, well, I shouldn't say that. I'm not a linguist, so this is me just trying to summarize what I understand from the linguistic scholarship. But like the stuff that really gives it away as late is often Persian influence, right? You've got a lot of Persian loanwords in some of those later sources. Um, uh, and yeah, that just like that kind of stuff. There's development that's is just like changes in emphases and which words or expressions, which kind of grammatical forms are preferred in certain situations that aren't necessarily Persian influenced or foreign influenced, um, but that those are the thing, like the Persian influence, and then Aramaic. You see a lot more Aramaic come into the language during those periods as well. So those are just like you said, the 30,000 foot view of like those are the stages of Hebrew, um, and what can be like that exists within the corpus of biblical texts, right? And so the reason this is relevant to this discussion um, is because by and large, and there may be exceptions here and there, but by and large, the Pentateuchal material is written in standard biblical Hebrew or classical biblical Hebrew. And this is a point that a lot of scholars will make if they're going to argue for pre-exilic date for all or most of the Pentateuch. And it's some of the very best. It's not like everyone thinks that only apologists argue for this. It's not really That's not really how it is, right? Like it's actually some of the very best biblical scholars and very best Hebraists and things like that who will make some of these arguments and argue for like the early dating of this material. And actually, like around the mid 20th century, it was this recognition that that all of the source material appears to be predominantly written in classical biblical Hebrew, that resulted in or began a movement among some scholars to actually move the date of P from its position in the exilic or post-exilic period to an earlier date in the pre-exilic period. And that's something that, like I said, that was a trend that maybe started about the middle of the 20th century, um, and it's probably still a minority of scholars who actually would defend that, but it's a very substantive and very impressive group of scholars that do so. It includes some of the biggest names in the study of the Pentateuch, and particularly in the study of the priestly literature, like Jacob Milgrom, who wrote the Anchor Bible Commentary on Leviticus, who argues for a pre-exilic date for P, and like Moshe Weinfeld, who, again, just a major contributor to Pentateuchal studies in the late 20th century and early 21st century. Um, and just a whole host of others, a lot of scholars, uh, Gary Rensburg, Avi Hurwitz, a lot of these names may not mean very much to your audience, but just a lot of scholars began to realize, like, hey, no, the priestly work, the material we identify as priestly, it's all in standard biblical Hebrew. And Avi Hurwitz in particular, he started comparing it to Ezekiel and saying it looks like it's actually earlier than the Ezekiel material. And so it's got to be pre-exilic. Richard Elliott Friedman's another one who has supported this. Um, Lots and lots of scholars. Some of the, again, it's not necessarily a majority, but it's some very significant scholars who deserve to be taken quite seriously, who will argue that no, the priestly stuff appears to be pre-exilic.
Yeah. Just kind of summarizing a couple things that I think are really important that you just said. As we're talking about like how scholars will differentiate between layers or strata, and that seems to be really messy. It's not as clear cut as we might assume, or as some scholars would like you to believe. Um, Linguists in their field of study, who study Hebrew and its development from as far back as we can really see, which is probably like late Bronze Age at the earliest. Um, and this is one thing that you mentioned that I think is really important for differentiating the history of development of the language is the earliest layers of Hebrew that we see being written seem to be more like poetry, which is where
Mhm.
you get things like the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, or um, Judges 5 with the Song of Deborah, and Deuteronomy 32, for example, the Song of Moses. These poetic sort of uh, texts. And then after a period of time, this is probably now after the turn of the millennia, we see a kind of an explosion of historical narrative prose. People are actually starting to write narratives about the history of their people, the patriarch, the what do you call them, the
The
patriarchal
patriarchal
narratives
narratives.
and so
Yeah.
forth seem to kind of explode during this time period for a good chunk of time, and that seems to be one way that scholars have differentiated time periods that seems to be fairly static amongst a lot of people who are looking at this from a linguistic side. Have you seen that to be the case? Do you see much from the linguists that suggest that there might be something else going on there, or do they all kind of seem to be leaning towards a development from poetry to historical narrative prose to wisdom literature and so forth, legal documents and whatnot?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think that pretty much tracks with what I've read and with what I'm familiar with is yeah, they're the earliest 100% the earliest stuff is poetic, and it's poetic material, and there's probably I mean, I don't know, I have not studied the Psalms closely and the dating of the Psalms, but I know that like a lot of the Psalms material has some of these archaic features as well, and can even be compared to there's like Richard Hess, I think, off the top of my head, has compared a lot of like the literary forms you find in the Psalms to to Canaanite sources that we have from the late Bronze Age, right? And you just
Yeah.
see there's a lot of very similar imagery and phraseology and expression and grammar and stuff like that. And so there's probably a lot of archaic material in the Psalms as well. But my focus has been on the Pentateuch. But yeah, there's a transition. But the distinction really, yeah, between archaic and standard or classical is we see a transition to historical narrative prose. And again, exactly when that happens is where you're going to get some debate. Um, but yeah, turn of the millennium, if you will, about that time or sometime thereafter is seems to be when that shift happens. And I was actually just reading before we started this. I didn't put it in my paper, but I'm continuing to read and study this sort of stuff. But I was just reading a scholar arguing that it's the establishment of the monarchy that creates the impetus for this, right? Because you've now got a new form of government. You've got a new country, if you will, a new national identity, and you need to forge a narrative, a story around who are we and why do we exist? What is our purpose? And so you have this rise of a monarchy and this new nation around the turn of the millennium there with David and Solomon, and that becomes an impetus for creating national literature, right? A body of Hebrew literature that's going to tell your story. And so you start telling these stories about your ancestors. You start telling these stories about the um, the Exodus, stuff that is probably already in your traditions in some way, shape, or form before, but now you're telling big sweeping narratives about the whole of it, right? And that's where you get maybe some of these early attempts to tell the story from the beginning, in the beginning, right? Genesis 1:1, from the beginning through the history of the ancestors and the Exodus and up to the formation of the monarchy is kind of this culmination of history, really, right? And you see the same thing, this scholar that I was just reading, it's Gary Rensburg for what it's worth, but he compares it to like uh, the founding of the American Revolution, and then what do we get? Like within a couple generations, you get the birth of like American literature with guys like Emerson and Thoreau and all of these guys who kind of give birth to a national American literature, and you start getting people telling the American story and how we the story of the revolution and all of this stuff, right? And it becomes this form of literature and this narrative that gives us a national identity, right? And you've got to have that, right? If you're going to form a new country, form a new nation. So the argument, yeah, that's all a long way of saying, yeah, I think that's roughly accurate as far as that division and that shift. Um, and then you get other stuff that comes along. You get prophecies and oracles and things like that that come along during the Iron Age, and hence you get the prophetic books and so on and so forth.
Um, I want to come back to this in just a second and talk about maybe some examples of where we see um, the Hebrew language sort of borrowing from like Ugaritic or Akkadian or maybe some other things at different points in time. Um, but as you were talking, a couple things kind of came to mind. Talking about the oral traditions that would eventually become the written historical narratives, things like the patriarchal stories, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and even Joseph, and then like the stories of the Exodus with Moses and so forth. Um, because much of the historical narratives are not being written down in Hebrew until a little bit later, and even the earliest stuff we have is more of the poetry. Um, what does that say or imply about uh, the difference between oral tradition and written tradition? And do you have any thoughts about like what that might imply about and we can cut this out if you don't want to talk about this, a historical Moses figure. And is that even necessary to have what would eventually be called the Torah?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that the questions of like a historical Moses and like even a historical Abraham are obviously very important to us as Latter-day Saints. And we do have faith claims that put a stake in the ground on those sorts of things.
Yeah,
And
I should probably clarify. Obviously, you and I would both believe in a historical figure named Moses or Abraham and so forth, and it's within the tradition of our own scriptures that these are historical figures. Um, Joseph Smith would attest, along with many others, that they were visited by some of these historical figures as well. Um, so I guess I'm asking more specifically about uh, I'm asking specifically from the perspective of someone looking at the source criticism of the Pentateuch, and what might uh, they say about some of these questions, and what can we confidently say?
yeah, so yeah, as far as that goes, like there's obviously because what we have in the written form that's been codified into the Pentateuch, what we have is generally believed to be, and for good reason, it's dated to predominantly the Iron Age, as we talked about. Um, and that is, several hundred years after a putative Moses or a Abraham figure would have existed. And so that raises questions about historical, historicity of those figures, historical reliability of the narratives, and stuff like that from the perspective of a historian. Um, I do think that, and at various parts of my paper, I do kind of point out that while the form that we have written down, and I mean, I guess to just spoiler alert for everybody, I more or less come to the conclusion that all of the different parts probably are coming together in the late 8th or 7th century BC. And so that's the latter part of the Iron Age, but that's, maybe 100 to 50 years before the opening of the Book of Mormon. And so I think there's a good case to be made that that's when it really kind of all comes together. But I go through other indications that there's probably earlier forms of this material, and there's traces of that in there. And I actually do think I don't know if it's quite as clear in the paper itself, but I actually touch on this very briefly towards the end. Uh, I do think that a lot of this can have or does have roots or origins in the late Bronze Age. And, historical Moses would be about the 13th century BC. There's some debate as to when that would be. But to the extent that scholars grant a Mosaic age, or even if they don't believe there was a historical Moses, they'll usually agree that like about the 13th century BC is when he would have existed. Um, and that's part of the late Bronze Age. And I actually think that there's a reasonable case that a lot of this material has at least its seeds or a core origin in that period. Um, and so it's it's not really provable that there was a Mosaic figure who maybe initiated some of this and organized it for the first time or whatever. But I don't think it's out of the question, right, that this tradition, that there was this the tradition that's being passed on and eventually gets written down during the monarchy, that Israel came out of Egypt, is based on some kind of real historical experience, right? And that Moses, whose name a lot of scholars believe is Egyptian, which would be weird to make up for your national hero figure if you're making this up and you're Hebrew, and it. In fact, sometimes this is uh, New Testament scholars who do like historical Jesus stuff will talk about the criterion of embarrassment, right? Sometimes this is kind of like, oh, it's kind of embarrassing that this national hero figure has a foreign name, Moses, and in fact, it was probably Moses means son of in Egyptian, right? And so it's like Ramses is son of Ra, right? Uh, it's kind of weird that it's just Moses and not a deity name with Moses, right? And so they think it's probably his full name probably did have an Egyptian deity name on it. And so you're suppressing that detail in your narratives. But all of that would speak to there must have been a real historical Moses. Why would you make up this historical figure with this embarrassing name, this pagan name, right? So and scholars like Certainly James Hoffmeyer and Kenneth Kitchen, who are both Egyptologists, have made really, I think, pretty good cases for a historical exodus. But even Richard Elliott Friedman came out with a book a few years ago called The Exodus, where he argues that at least a Levitical priesthood group came out of Egypt. And there is a lot of interesting tie-ins um, to the priestly practices, the priesthood organization practices of the Levitical priests in the Bible and Egyptian priesthood that, again, Hoffmeyer actually explores a lot of in some of his writings. But and there's other features like the tabernacle. I had a whole portion on this that I cut out of the paper before we got published, but I've got like another 18 pages on a lot of this priestly stuff. So um, the tabernacle is really strong comparisons to late Bronze Age Egyptian tent shrines and actually military encampments and things like that. That again, it's not just people like Kenneth Kitchen and James Hoffmeyer who sometimes get dismissed because they're evangelical Christians, but they're also top tier Egyptologists, mind you. Um, but Richard Elliott Friedman is persuaded by that stuff to say the tabernacle appears to be a late Bronze Age thing, or at least an early Iron Age thing. And Michael Homan, who was also a biblical scholar, who published a thing on tents, 2 year tents, so Israel, published it with Brill a number of years ago. He has two whole chapters on the tabernacle where he argues that, yeah, he compares it to a bunch of the Egyptian stuff, also some of the Ugaritic stuff that you already mentioned. You've got gods with tents, tent shrines in the Ugaritic material. Um, Really, that's the whole like tent shrine thing is like a late Bronze, early Iron Age phenomenon in the ancient Near East that goes away after that, as far as we can tell in the archaeology. And you've got Michael Homan who argues that um, the detailed description of the tabernacle that you get at the end of Exodus, um, he basically says, yeah, that's got to be describing a real tent shrine that stood in either the late Bronze or early Iron Age, and the description's got to be contemporary. And so this is really early source material that makes its way into the Pentateuch, according to him. And you can see where the logic comes from. Again, these tent shrines really are only a thing during that period. And then how would you get a detailed description of it centuries later, right? Uh, that wouldn't make any sense. Not to mention, just from the historical perspective, like all the other parallels they have to the ancient Near East, when you get descriptions, you get this two-step process where a deity reveals either a temple or a shrine that needs to be built and gives detailed instructions as to how it is to be built, and then the person builds it. And those accounts are always contemporary to the actual construction of the temple or whatever it may be, right? And so he kind of argues from those two point of views that this has to be like this description here of the tabernacle has to be really early material here. Um, so so yeah, you've got stuff that I actually think there's good reason to believe there's a lot of material embedded within. It goes through some editing and development that again reflects the later times and the Iron Age and some of the things you can see and I don't know if you want to go into it, but I mean in my paper I talk about like we already talked about like the historical linguistics and how that shifted a lot of scholars towards a pre-exilic P, but there's a lot of archaeology that's starting to shift opinions on that too. Archaeologists like Avram Faust and others have basically compared the material culture of the priestly source and said this looks like it's the Iron Age and not the Persian period. And so I'm not denying that there's development and there's reflections of later periods in the text, but there are also things that appear to come from even earlier source material that does appear to go back to about the time that Moses would have lived. That's kind of my long way of getting around to this idea that, and so a historical Moses who might have been a real national hero, a national leader who led at least a group of people who became important to the formation of Israel out of Egypt and maybe started some of these traditions, some of these religious practices with the tabernacle, with some of the Levitical priestly rites and things like that. Again, which lots of the legal and cultic material in Leviticus and Numbers, strong parallels to late second millennium material. Um, so again, there could be an origin point there that starts with a figure like Moses, but it undergoes development as priests over time practice these rituals and have to adapt them for various reasons. You maybe even get competing traditions, and that's where you get some of the competing legal corpuses that are now embedded together in the Pentateuch, right? With like the covenant code and the priestly code and the Deuteronomic code and things like that, um, which could spawn from this kind of original starting point with a Moses-like figure. And if you imagine like I don't know if you have family reunions terribly often, but I haven't had a family reunion on my dad's side at least, which is the big side of my family for several years. But you imagine getting together in a big family reunion and and you start talking with some of your cousins, or your kids start talking to some of their like your cousins' kids, and so you're multiple generations down, and they all start telling stories they've heard about grandma and grandpa, or great grandma and grandpa, or however fact you back you want to go for 'em, right?
Yeah.
You're going to find out that hey, over in so and so's family, they've been telling this story a little different, right? They've been telling different stories about grandma and grandpa or great grandma and grandpa, and or sometimes they've been telling the same story, but some of the details are different and stuff like that. That's kind of how I imagine the traditions develop. You talked about oral, there's kind of like an oral transmission period that takes place before. There's oral traditions that stand behind the eventual writing and codifying of these texts and prose narratives. Um, that's kind of how I imagine it going. Is you've got some of the different groups and tribes within Israel, and they're telling stories among themselves, and maybe every so often there's an annual festival or whatever, right? And so you get together as multiple tribes and multiple clans get together and they swap stories every now and then, but for the most part these stories are developing within local environments, and that again that speaks to like the northern versus southern points of view that you can see in some of these different stories and things like that. They're gonna develop kind of in these local environments, and over time, you're gonna get some diverging stories. You're gonna get some similar stories with a little bit of differences. You're gonna have some groups that perpetuate certain stories that the other group just doesn't tell, right? And um, one some scholars believe that when the Northern Kingdom gets destroyed in the late 8th century BC, there's this influx of refugees, and we can actually see it archaeologically. We just see this booming growth of Jerusalem, and right at that same time, and a lot of scholars think those refugees from the Northern Kingdom are bringing, at least as oral traditions, but possibly even as written source material. In fact, like I said, the e-source, if you not all scholars agree there's an e-source anymore, but to the extent that scholars still argue for an e-source, a lot of scholars believe that's a northern text, right? Deuteronomy, a lot of people think, if they don't think it was made up whole cloth by Josiah and his priests, a lot of scholars think that there was a proto-Deuteronomy that came from the Northern Kingdom that then gets adapted and reworked and edited in the 7th century, and then becomes this important text for Josiah's reforms. But
Yeah.
you have these kinds of indications of northern versus southern perspectives and stuff like that. And a lot of people think this is when it all comes together, right? Is when those refugees come and they bring this literature in. And like I said, that's kind of what I pick as the nexus of when a lot of this material could have come together and formed an initial form of the Pentateuch that could have been on the brass plates, right? So
Yeah. No, that's so one of the things I was thinking about too is you know, Deuteronomy seems to be one of the most hotly debated texts of the Pentateuch in terms of its source. Um, because it seems to be, as you've already pointed out, there are those in the camp of Josiah made it up whole cloth with his priests as a way to centralize all power into Jerusalem. Uh, and then there are also those who believe the more traditional I guess the narrative that is presented in the biblical text, for example, in Second Kings, or chapter 22 or whatever, that the whole narrative of Josiah finding it with his priests as they're renovating the temple and realizing, oh hey, there's this whole book of the law that we forgot about. Um, there is one piece of interesting evidence, I think, in the book of Deuteronomy itself that seems to be coming from a northern Israel source rather than a southern Judah source. If and this is just kind of me off the cuff remembering stuff from your paper as well, but like if you're Josiah and you're going to make up this text whole cloth as a way to centralize all political and religious power to Jerusalem under your immediate control, it's interesting that the text itself has, in at least two or three places, I believe, references to places in northern Israel as the place that would hold the name of God, and that would be the place where you would go to worship, like Mount Ebal and so forth.
Yeah.
Again, within the narrative of Deuteronomy, this is Moses basically taking his people up to just beyond the borders of what would become their homeland, and saying basically, let's have a refresher and remind ourselves of all that the Lord has done for us, and let me prepare you to go enter into and claim your promised land. Um, and it's interesting that there are portions of that point to places in northern Israel as like the place that you will go up to worship, and
Yeah.
offer sacrifices and so forth. So I do think that there's something to be said there, in terms of maybe where at least those passages may be from an earlier source or from a source in the northern hill country of Samaria or northern Israel, rather than from Jerusalem, from Judah, in the immediate time period of Josiah's reign. Um, so there are some interesting things like that you mentioned in the paper that I wanted to point out specifically for those who are interested in this kind of debate around Deuteronomy.
Yeah, yeah, the Deuteronomy is interesting. I don't spend a lot of time on Deuteronomy in the paper, and a big part of that is because, yes, there's a big debate, but really either position works okay for us as far as can Deuteronomy be on the brass plates, right? So, um, and so I don't spend a lot of time, but I do try to make it, try to give people, well, I do try to help people realize that the situation, the picture is more complicated than maybe is sometimes presented. Like it's, oh, it's this obvious 7th century forgery that is made to support the reforms of Josiah or whatever. There's a few different things that I think mitigate that particular position. Um, uh, One of which is, so one of the big pieces of evidence for a 7th century date for the Book of Deuteronomy is the comparison between the Esarhaddon succession treaty or vassal treaty. You'll sometimes hear it called one or the other, but Esarhaddon is the successor to I think it's Ashurbanipal, but I don't know. I don't have my king list, my Assyrian king list right in front of me, but I think it's Ashurbanipal dies um, in 669 and Esarhaddon takes over. Um, or maybe I'm getting that backwards. I don't know. In any case, the Esarhaddon succession treaty is a treaty that comes just a few years before that transition of power in 669, basically getting all the vassals of the Assyrian Empire to commit to continue to be faithful and loyal to Assyria under the son of the king, right, when he dies. And it's dated generally to 672 BC. Um, and there are parallels to that and the curses and blessings and things in Deuteronomy 13 and Deuteronomy 28. And scholars have debated how close those parallels really are. Um, and scholars who want to date the whole book of Deuteronomy earlier will point to earlier treaties that also have curses and things like that. But a lot of scholars, this is like one of the like scholars will actually call Deuteronomy the linchpin for dating the Pentateuch. Um, because this is one of the things where they feel pretty confident, like, okay, we can definitely link at least parts of Deuteronomy to this. Um, the problem that that creates for this idea that it's made up whole cloth for the purposes of Josiah's reforms is something that actually Jeffrey Stackert points out in a pretty recent book, Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch from 2022, published by Yale. But he points out that these sort of succession treaties have a really short shelf life. They are not something that 50 years later you're going to be like in the archive referencing and using as a model for a text that you're going to make up to like champion for your reforms. And, it's around 620, 622, 23 BC whenever the thing happens. These are pretty quickly replaced. Once the actual succession process happens, these are pretty quickly replaced with a new treaty under the new king. And so, if we really are going to argue that there's a link to this succession treaty, then the composition, or at least an initial version of Deuteronomy needs to be composed or edited around 670 BC. Within just like there's like a 3-year window that it has to happen in. And that can't possibly have been done with Josiah's reforms in mind 50 years later, right? So Josiah's reforms are not on the horizon at this point. This is the middle of Manasseh's reign, who's the villain, right, in the biblical story. But I thought that was a pretty interesting argument. I mentioned it in my thing because I do want to help people understand. So we really kind of now have two core dates that link Deuteronomy to the 7th century, Josiah's reforms around 620-ish BC, and then the succession treaty around 670-ish BC. Those are kind of two anchor dates, and there might be some editing and redaction going on in between those two dates, but those link it to the 7th century. And again, for my purposes of can it be on the brass plates, I feel like we're in pretty good standing at that point. But I do continue to go on and say, look, as you were just talking about, there are a lot of scholars who think this is actually a northern text that originates in northern Israel and is brought by these refugees in the 8th century BC. So there's some sort of earlier version, and I think I have a quote in there from a scholar who says that the material that is often linked to the succession treaty that we just talked about is secondary. It appears to maybe be edited into the text. So there's maybe at least an earlier 8th century version that gets edited in around 670-ish BC, and then maybe gets edited again around the time of Josiah's reforms when it's rediscovered. But really, if it's a Northern Kingdom text that was preserved by the Northern Kingdom, you actually have some logical sense to the biblical narrative of, hey, this book disappeared. We hadn't heard of this book, and then it just like appears out of nowhere to us in the 7th century BC. And we're like, oh, wow, we haven't been following this law all this time. But there's other arguments too. You mentioned the Mount Ebal thing and the place of the name. That's coming from Sandra Richter, who has done some really interesting stuff. Basically, yeah, in Deuteronomy, you have this idea that people are supposed to do blessings and curses, and I can't remember which is which, but one is on Mount Ebal and the other is on Mount Gerizim, and both of those are Northern Kingdom sites, right?
Yeah, they're like
Um,
twin mountains kind of near each other.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I think if I'm remembering correctly, they're like twin mountains, and then down in the valley in between is the city of Shechem.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and Gerizim is the mountain for blessings, and Ebal is for cursings.
okay, yeah. So there we go. Um, and a lot of scholars have assumed that the place where the Lord would set his name is Jerusalem, and the author is just being really coy about it or whatever. But it's never outright said to be Jerusalem. And Sandra Richter actually goes through ancient Near Eastern parallels and all kinds of really concrete evidence that shows that the way this is being used is it's being used to describe uh, monuments where either the king or the god has their name engraved, and then uh, you know, um, and their commands or whatever, right? And Deuteronomy pretty clearly says to do that on Mount Ebal, right? That to establish a monument to his name in Deuteronomy 27. And so I thought she made a pretty compelling argument that that is the place where the Lord would set his name in Deuteronomy. Uh, that's not only is that like that not only is that indication of maybe a northern origin for the narrative, or for the material, but it's also an indication of very early origin because we have archaeologically, we have evidence of worship and ritual activity on Mount Ebal in the early Iron Age between 1250 and 1100 BC, and pretty much no evidence that that's regarded as a sacred site anytime after that. So again, there's some sort of core material here that seems to be very, very early, or at least is remembering a very, very early practice and incorporating it into the narrative. Um, she also goes through a lot of the legal material in Deuteronomy's 5 through 27, and kind of argues that it reflects economic realities of maybe the Iron 1 to Iron 2 transition, which a lot of scholars would date around like the 10th or 9th century BC. So, again, there seems to be an argument for a, an earlier version, an earlier core material here. And she acknowledges, I just gave a big block of material, Deuteronomy 5 through 27. There are various passages in there that she points out, okay, this looks like it might be a later editorial layer added when Israel's economy is a little more sophisticated or complex or whatever. And so it's not that like 100% of that material goes back to that early, but she kind of argues that the bulk of that legal material reflects a very early Iron Age kind of setting. Um, and then we already talked about like there's Deuteronomy 32 and actually 33 as well is often considered archaic. Um, and one of the big arguments kind of clashes in biblical studies over Deuteronomy right now, or well, for the last several decades, has been what relationship it may have, if any, to the Hittite treaties. Um,
Yeah.
so the Hittite people are really only around. I don't know exactly what their beginning and end dates are, but they're like a second millennium BC group. You see them referenced in the Bible, particularly as Israel is settling in the land of Canaan. They're listed as some of the people that are there, and they show up in a couple places in the patriarchal narratives. Like I think Esau marries Hittite women or something like that. Um,
Yeah,
but
that sounds about right.
Um, so you have Hittites showing up in the Bible, and we have the archaeology for Hittites up until about like the 9th century BC, I think, is when they kind of disappear. Don't, if someone go Google it and get a more accurate date, and if I'm wrong, like I'm not going to lose too much sleep. That might be really late for their disappearance. But all of the evidence we have of their like the inscriptions we have for their treaties and stuff like that come from like the late Bronze Age, maybe early Iron, but they come from like the 13th and 14th century BC. And they have a particular structure that they follow, and you have like other ancient Near Eastern treaties from different times and places. And Kenneth Kitchen and Paul Lawrence, they put together it's a massive 3-volume study of treaty law and covenant in the ancient Near East, where they line up like well over 100 of these different treaties, and they analyze the structure and pattern that they have. And it's pretty widely recognized that, well, I shouldn't say pretty widely, but there's a number of scholars who have recognized, Kitchen and Lawrence among them, that the structure of the Hittite treaties from the late Bronze Age uh, appears to be the structural pattern that you see in the book of Deuteronomy with it. And the reason that's important is because Deuteronomy is a covenant, right? It's about making a covenant. It's kind of describing this covenant making process, which is patterned after these treaty patterns. And so you have this overall structural design that looks like it's patterned after these Hittite treaties. Um, and the big debate is, what does that really mean, or what the implications of that are? And a lot of scholars like Kitchen and Lawrence and a number of others, and I quote from several in my paper there, basically argue that it's indicative of a very early core to Deuteronomy at the very least. That the structure of Deuteronomy uh, is is patterned in the same way as a Hittite treaty, and the reason for that is because it dates to about the same time, and they're structuring the narrative in a way that would reflect covenant making procedures of that time and place. And they point out that there are differences in the way these Neo-Assyrian treaties, like the Esarhaddon succession treaty that we talked about earlier, they are structured differently, and they have differences there. And so um, I kind of try to take a middle position. I don't know that I would go so far as to argue that the whole book of Deuteronomy uh, is written in the late Bronze Age, but it does seem to me, at least, that there's maybe some kind of core material that's pretty early, and there's maybe some adaptation and development within that structure that's established at the very beginning, right? That follows the Hittite treaty pattern. Um, there's some adaptation and editing and expansion that takes place uh, at some of these different time periods that we already kind of mentioned. We see evidence linking parts of Deuteronomy to, and eventually you get these late seventh century influence in editing and maybe even rewriting to some extent, because I do think there's a good bit of seventh century milieu reflected in different parts of the text. I think I talk about William Schniedewine's argument that writing is a really important feature of Deuteronomy, and that's not so much the case for the rest of the Pentateuch. And he kind of argues that's because in the seventh century, literacy has become more widespread in Israel or in Judah at the time. And so I think that does reflect some adaptation of the material in the seventh century. I'm persuaded by that argument. But the point being, we're not reverting to some sort of simplistic, we're not rejecting like the documentary hypothesis or source criticism in general and reverting to some kind of simplistic uh, mosaic authorship for the Pentateuch per se. There is a long, complex development. There's layers, and I think we can actually see different time points and points of connection within the composition of Deuteronomy, for instance. I don't know that we can reconstruct all the details for how and when it was put together with with a fine tooth comb, like a lot of maybe source critics would like to do. But I do think that we see there are layers, right? And there's a long process of development, but I think it's early, right? And I think it goes back to maybe a late Bronze Age or early Iron Age time period where a Moses-like figure could have been influential in shaping that and maybe been the originator of maybe an early version that gets adapted over time, right?
Yeah, and with respect to Deuteronomy as a text, as we have it today, um, we can see within the text that it's it's harkening back to and borrowing from and even sort of revising portions of the rest of the Pentateuch from Genesis
Hmm.
through Numbers. And so it seems to be that a lot of scholars that would refer to Deuteronomy as a sort of linchpin, so to speak, are looking at the whole of the text, at least as we have it in its current form, and saying it makes an awful lot of emphasis on writing and making sure that things are written down. Um, and it also is utilizing and revising many different passages and narratives and things from the rest of the Pentateuch. So it must be borrowing from those other texts, or at least borrowing from the same sources that those texts are also borrowing from. So
Yeah.
that would make sense then that Deuteronomy as a text would be a little bit later to the game in its more, I guess, if you want to call it a completed form, we can.
Yeah.
But in the form that we come to think of it as the text of Deuteronomy, and so I think there's a lot of cool things there that could be teased out as well. And so I like that you mentioned the emphasis on writing during this time period, and that would make sense with Deuteronomy and how it's focused on making sure that these traditions, these policies and procedures and things are being written down for their people. Um, And it reminded me too. It made me think about like I don't know how everybody reads the Old Testament. When we get to the text in Kings and Chronicles and so forth, and there's a division between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and they're no longer like one unified Israel for that period of time before the Assyrians come over. But having read a fair bit of scholarship on some of this time period in Israel's history, the Northern Kingdom is really kind of like the big kingdom. This is the more heavily populated kingdom. It's the more wealthy
Hmm.
kingdom. Judah is really kind of like, for all intents and purposes, the redheaded stepchild. They're a much smaller kingdom, a much smaller localized community. Um, they very clearly have uh, you know some very strong tendencies towards uh, a, I guess, monolatrous worship of Yahweh, whereas the Northern Kingdom seems to be much more diverse in its religious observance uh, in certain periods of time, which is precisely what Hezekiah and Josiah seem to be pushing against.
Yeah.
Um, and it's really not until the Assyrians come over and take out the Northern Kingdom that you get all these refugees that flood into the Southern Kingdom, that now Jerusalem and Judah become much bigger and seem to be taking a front seat role. It's almost kind of like, it's been described to me um, as kind of like, you know, if you're a young boy growing up and your older brother moves out and goes to college, you're kind of like the man of the house filling that vacuum, uh, taking care of the household duties and stuff while your brother's away. And so um, it's kind of like Judah takes on uh, this greater role once the Assyrians come over and refugees have now flooded into the southern Levant. And with that comes their writings, their oral traditions that seem to be, um, you know, in some sense, shared cultural histories. Um, but also, as you mentioned earlier, like there's some differences. If you go to a family reunion and your cousins and you get together and you all start talking about, stories about grandma and grandpa, you might be talking about the same story, but you'll remember details differently, things
Yeah.
like that. And so some of these details that are different get worked in together into these texts, which is
Hmm.
why it can be so difficult for scholars today, all these many centuries later, to try and figure out like, what do we make sense of these details that seem to be at odds with each other. One of these must have been from one source, another from another source, and whatnot. But the emphasis on Hezekiah and Josiah and that time period in like the 8th and 7th century, uh, being big into writing and their and writing down their narrative histories and their treaties and their, um, for lack of a better term, policies and procedures of
Yeah.
their kingdoms. Like that makes a lot of sense when you realize that in the preceding decades, they've just had an influx of thousands of people from the Northern Kingdom who have lost their land, they've lost their homes. And if we don't incorporate them and assimilate them into our communities, they'll lose their histories. And so
Yeah.
it becomes a very important part of uh, their assimilation that these things are written down.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And we talked a little bit earlier about like the United Monarchy being a point in which a lot of this might have gotten an initial literary form, at least because y- you're forming a new nation, and what do you need? You need some sort of unifying national narrative. And you see the same kind of need here um, when you've got all these refugees coming in. And frankly, I mean, I've seen different estimates, but some scholars as much as 50% of the population of Judah is actually Israelite at this point, right? Um, and you might have some kind of shared cultural history or heritage, but you've also had centuries of kind of maybe not strictly kind of frenemy relationships sometimes, right? It's there are times where they're actually, there's the Ephro-Syrian war, not too long before all of this, right? During the time of Isaiah and I think Ahaz might be the king during that. Um,
Yeah, so these would be
where
what, the early chapters of Isaiah?
yeah, where they're actually I think they're in conflict there, right? But there are other
Yeah.
times my details on Second Kings history is rusty, but there are times when Israel and Judah are allies. There are times when Judah is a vassal to Israel, um, and
Yeah, it's a big
you could
brother, little brother.
yeah,
Almost kind of like,
and so
stop hitting yourself.
there's kind of a shared history, but there's antagonism and allyship that goes into that. Um, One of the interesting things I think is, I mean, there is the fact that they speak the same language, they write the same language. You've got neighboring cultures that have similar languages, Northwest Semitic languages uh, like like Aramaic, like Phoenician, like I'm not sure what other ones would be off the top of my head, but you've got these other similar Northwest Semitic languages from your neighbors, but these two, oh, Edomite would maybe be another one, right?
Yeah.
Um, but these two kingdoms, they have a shared language, and that tells you there is some sort of closer kinship, closer shared history, and that would, from the biblical perspective, and obviously from what I think, that goes back to the United Monarchy and the time when they were considered one. They considered themselves one people. Um, but yeah, the Northern Kingdom really is Big Brother, right, through all of that. And so you can see why maybe getting a big influx of these refugees, for one thing, they're going to come with a little bit more sophisticated culture to some extent than, you know, Judah was probably kind of seen like their little brother, they're maybe a little backwater, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is so you're bringing in people who are coming from a bigger, a little bit more complex, sophisticated kingdom with more culture, more arts, more literary attainment as it is, right? And so you start to see why all of a sudden you see this explosion, this growth of the city of Jerusalem. You see this explosion in writing activity right in the time of Hezekiah and later kings. And at least that's the argument, right, from Schneedewind and others have followed similar trajectories there. Um, but there is a need, like you were saying, to give these refugees have lost their sense of like identity, right? And so there's a need to give them, as they're becoming part of your society, there's a need to give them a sense of like, yeah, I am a part of this, right? Um, and that's something I talk about in my paper. Again, drawing largely from Schneedewind, but maybe a few others if I'm remembering off the top of my head here. But um, where he basically kind of argues that like the whole Pentateuch is the story of the 12 tribes, like all Israel, right? And you can see why a story like compiling earlier source material and telling a story like that in the time of Hezekiah could be actually really important to unifying your the population around a single identity, and not being divisive between Judah and Israel, at the time. Um, so telling this kind of unifying story about all of Israel and the ancestors of all of Israel, um, at that time would be really important. And I think that plays a role in Schneedewein's argument for why most of the Pentateuch, he believes is being composed in that setting, right?
Yeah. So, I guess to kind of like uh to get this back to like the brass plates in the Book of Mormon. We're talking about the time period around the end of the 7th century, early 6th century, 600 BC. Um So this is just post Josiah and his reforms. So we would already have something like the Book of the Law, or what we really think of today as like probably the earlier version of Deuteronomy. We have a number of these other traditions that have been written down and compiled in the other texts that of the Pentateuch or the Torah. Um, one thing I found interesting that you mentioned in your paper, and I'm going to be interested in kind of my own personal research or study on this as well, is going through texts like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, which are written around this time period of the Babylonian exile.
Hmm.
And from kind of two different perspectives too, right? You have Ezekiel, who is writing, and he's basically like exiled himself with a number of other exilees, I guess, in Egypt, right? And then you have Jeremiah, this other prophetic priestly figure, and they're both writing kind of as contemporaries of each other. Um, they both seem to have a good bit of knowledge about the whole of the Pentateuch, the whole of the
Yeah.
Torah. They both are referencing things in their works that are from kind of the whole strata of Genesis to Deuteronomy. I'm wondering if you have anything you wanted to say on that before we kind of like move into more Book of Mormon brass plates.
Well, yeah, and well, in fact, that's an important data point for you know, suggesting that it could be on the brass plates, right? Is these prophets are contemporary with each other, but they're also contemporary with Nephi, right? And their writings, and I didn't put any specifics in the paper. In fact, that part of the paper was a little rushed, and so I needed to. I got it in there. I consider those kind of that's kind of a preliminary. Um, Part, preliminary argument there because I haven't fleshed it out as much as I'd like to, and I haven't studied it as much as I'd like to. But I did find there are a number of scholars, and again, just like everything else, you'll find people who might dispute or argue against this sort of stuff. But there are a number of scholars who have recognized um, that Ezekiel and Jeremiah appear to know of at least from the legal corpus perspective, they seem to know of both the D and the P source, and they seem to interact with both. Um, and there's a number, I wish I could remember some specific examples because I do remember reading a number of instances where the scholars talk specifically about the way the priestly stuff related to Ezekiel. Um, and kind of explained why it would not make sense for the priestly author to be deriving that material from Ezekiel and therefore be later, but it would make a lot more sense if Ezekiel knew the priestly material and was adapting it. But there were a bunch of examples of that that I found quite striking as part of the argument for why the priestly material should be pre-exilic specifically. But then the narrative material as well that you have in Genesis, Exodus, and other parts. Um, yeah, there seems to be pretty good knowledge of, and again, it comes in these little hints and glimmers here and there. You don't have a full recitation of the history of Israel, right, in either of those sources, but they seem to be interacting with full knowledge of the Torah, is the argument that George Fisher, I think, is one that I cite on that, but there are several others. I know that another like the Genesis 1 creation account, Jeremiah appears to have knowledge of that. I can't remember the specific passage in Jeremiah off the top of my head, but George Fisher, who I mentioned, talks about that. But so does um, Richard Elliott Friedman, who that's another one of his reasons. Genesis 1 being often considered part of the priestly source. It's one of his reasons for considering the priestly source pre-exilic, right? Is Jeremiah seems to know the Genesis material from the priestly source, and I think it's George Fisher who actually goes and shows that Jeremiah seems to know the very first chapter of Genesis, Genesis 1, but he also seems to know the very final part of Deuteronomy. And so he seems to kind of know the whole work from beginning to end, and he's got stuff in between there too. It's not just that he knows those two things, but um, and so yeah, I think there's a case to be made that these prophets, who, like I said, they're contemporaries to Nephi and Lehi, they seem to be working with a comprehensive knowledge of the full Pentateuch, or at least all of its sources, right? Um, and and so that would suggest if they can know and be engaging with that text as a whole, or again either as a whole or more or less all of the source material, then so can Nephi. Basically, is kind of the argument. Um, and it's not a problem. It's not anachronistic then for Nephi to know the full Torah or all of its source material, or most of its source material. And a copy of that material could have wound up on the brass plates. Basically, it would be contemporaneous and could have been copied on. So
Yeah. Well, and if we're going to take the historicity of the Book of Mormon and its claims seriously, um, Lehi and his family are members of a northern tribe,
mhm.
right? Their origins are from northern Israel. The brass plates that are handed down and come to be in possession of Laban seem to have their origins from the northern tribe, or from the northern nation of Israel. Um, Laban himself being like a cousin or some sort of relative to Lehi. Um, and so it would make sense that at this time period, with the great influx of refugees from what's left of the northern kingdom into the south, carrying these traditions with them, corroborating them with those same traditions from the southern kingdom, and blending them together and so forth. It would make sense to me that the brass plates that Nephi carries with them out of Jerusalem and into the New World, uh, may reflect the traditions as passed to them from the Northern Kingdom. Um, and that's just my thinking. I don't have anything that would say one way or the other on that, but I'm curious. Um, Looking at these uh, brass plates in the early parts of the Book of Mormon, Nephi's reading from them. He's saying, "Look, it has a genealogy of our forebears. It has the 5 books of Moses. It has these other writings of Isaiah and things on it that he quotes from." Um, what do you think the brass plates are in terms of the Pentateuch? Uh, what kind of version of the Pentateuch do you think is most likely on these brass plates? Do you think that it could be more like a proto Pentateuch, like something a little bit earlier? Because these are already written on brass plates. It's who's to say when exactly they're being inscribed on these plates? If it's recent to the time when Nephi takes them, or if they've been there for decades, who knows? Do you have any kind of like musings? And this is kind of just a fun question, not so serious about we're not going to be able to determine on this podcast like exactly what was on the brass plates. But if you had to kind of guess, what kind of material do you think was on the plates that they would have called the 5 books of Moses in the Book of Mormon?
So I think the origins of the brass plates is like a whole nother question, right?
Yeah.
But within the context of my own argument, right, I'm arguing that a lot of biblical material was compiled and edited in the late 8th and into the 7th century BC. Um, and and if that's the case, and if you have something on the brass plates that is going to be similar to what we have on the Bible, and that material was largely edited at that time, not that it didn't exist in some shape or form earlier, but was largely edited and compiled into what might be a proto Pentateuch or a proto Bible, even speaking more broadly of some of the source material that might have been some of the written material that might have been coming together at that time. Um, if it's going to exist in a form that looks pretty similar to what we have, then you're hypothesizing that the brass plates are maybe a relatively recent copy of some of this material onto this metal source for some reason. Um, I know a lot of other people have suggested that the brass plates are a very old artifact that's been handed down for a long time in like the lineage of Laban, and there is some hint of that in Genesis 5, or not Genesis 5. There's a hint of Laban in the brass plates in Genesis 5, guys. No, just kidding. Um,
Yeah, we'll clip that one.
in First Nephi 5, there's a hint of that because it does say that like because of it just mentions that Laban is a descendant of Joseph, and because of his lineage, he was keeping the record, is kind of what it says. It's like, okay, so these maybe aren't brand spanking new when Lehi takes them, right? They're older than that, but how old are we talking? Well, the other thing that I think is worth noting is that we have when Nephi itemizes what's on the brass plates, he specifically mentions two things that are contemporary to him. He says that the history goes down to the reign of Zedekiah, and he mentions that some of the writings of Jeremiah are on those plates. Um, Now, that is very early to have writings of Jeremiah, okay? Because Jeremiah is an active prophet at the time. Um, and I'm not saying very early, like, holy cow, that's impossible. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that means these, these plates are being added to contemporaneously, right, to Nephi's own time. You've got, I mean, this is all taking place in the first year of the reign of Zedekiah, and you've already got down to the reign of Zedekiah on the plates, right? Like, so either it's an older artifact that's being kept up to date in some way, or it could be a relatively recently made like copy of some of this national literature that has, in the process of copying it onto the brass plates, been brought up to date in terms of the history that we're now at the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah. And maybe there's been some recent prophetic activity from Jeremiah that's gotten written down and copied onto the brass plates. But um, I don't. I'm kind of the opinion that the brass plates aren't actually that old. They're maybe a generation or two old as far as their origin, and part of that is just like I I'm trying to keep this as simple as we can for ourselves, right? When you posit like a really ancient set of brass plates going back, to who knows how far back, going back to Joseph. Some people have suggested that, right? The brass plates start with Joseph. Um, I think they're relatively recent because I think a lot of the biblical literature that gets copied onto there is relatively recent at that time. Again, has lots of earlier source material in it, but the the point in which it takes shape and form that might reasonably be described as the five books of Moses, a kind of a proto-Torah sort of thing, is again, as far as I'm concerned, no earlier than the late 8th or early 7th century BC. And I'm on the early side of that argument, right? Because people are, like we talked about at the beginning, lots of people are going to say, no, it's too late, or that's too early. It can't be. The Pentateuch comes together too late to be on there. So I think if we want to posit that like the brass plates are really early, we're creating different kinds of problems for ourselves that we don't have to because there's nothing in the text that actually requires the brass plates to be super ancient already by Lehi's time, right? So I think they're probably a relatively recent compilation. They are being kept by a Josephite lineage for some reason or another, and we know from Mosiah 1:4 they're being kept in Egyptian for some reason or another. And so the literature is being translated here, which is going to affect the kind of form that it's in. And we do know there is some additional maybe northern source material that's made it onto the brass plates because we know we've got Second Nephi 3, which talks about this prophecy from Joseph about Moses and about a future Joseph. Um, and then you've got references to prophets like Zenos and Zenoch, who are specifically said to be descendants of Joseph, I think, or to be from the tribe of Joseph or something. I can't remember off the top of my head. And because it has Lehi's lineage in it specifically, and he's from the tribe of Joseph, and Laban's lineage in it specifically. So there's additional genealogical material in there that can go back, that goes back to the period uh, of the patriarchs and ties Lehi and his line into Joseph. Well, why would you have that? Well, because it's a specific Josephite record that's keeping some additional genealogical material. And again, the fact that that genealogical material goes down to Lehi, or at least within enough generations that Lehi can say, okay, that guy was my ancestor and I can follow the line, suggests relatively recent updating, at least, of the material on there. So I think they're probably a relatively recent artifact that's being made by a Josephite group for some reason or another, and that does impact the material. There are differences. Um, there's, like I said, there's this story. The biggest one we know of, right, is we've got this prophecy from Joseph about Moses. That's clearly an indicative of like Josephite origin, and it's relevant to the Torah material, right? The other stuff that we have, like we have indications that they know something. They have some other traditions about Cain as well, right? And the secret combination stuff that we see reflected in the Book of Moses now, right? They've got some sort of source material on that as well on the brass plates. The question I would ask is, and I know I cite and reference the work of like Jeff Lindsay and Noel Reynolds, who have argued that like this is indicative that the brass plates version of Genesis had this material. Oh, excuse me, had this material in it. And maybe that might be true. They make some interesting arguments in that regard. Um, but I don't know that we can know enough to really say whether that material is embedded within a version of Genesis or whether it exists as some kind of separate source material that they're keeping on their own, like just as extra material somewhere. And to your question then about like, okay, so what does this actually look like on the brass plates? I have a couple of different theories. One is that maybe, like, if you want to go with the classic documentary hypothesis, maybe they literally just they have the J, E, D, and P on there. And those are four sources. Those could be the four books of Moses if you want. Um, I think, I can't remember if I mentioned it, but one thing that shows up a lot in the academic literature is the idea that there is a fifth source called H that's kind of part of P, but also kind of a separate source. Um, and so I actually suggest in the paper, maybe hypothetically you have a JEDPH on the brass plates, and there's your five books of Moses. And that looks totally different from what we have because that's not Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Um, but it's the sources before that, and there's five of them, and so that's your five books. Or maybe it's JEDP, and then some of this Josephite material, this northern material, um, that that relates to that same era, and so they lump it in. And there's your five books right there. I don't know, maybe something like that. But I think what we're actually dealing with is probably something that like would be you would have like a proto-Genesis, a proto-Exodus, a proto-Leviticus, proto-Numbers, and like a proto-Deuteronomy. Something that if we could actually get our hands on it, if we could get our hands on the brass plates and we could find these texts and we could translate them, I think you would have something that would pretty closely resemble what we have. Maybe, and I don't want to put numbers on it because like, maybe there's a chapter missing here and there, right? Do we need to have numbers 5 on the plates? Like, just to pick a random example, right? Like, I don't know. I don't think there's anything in Numbers 5 that absolutely has to be on the plates in order for the Book of Mormon to be true. So, but maybe something that has roughly 80% of the material we have in the Torah or the Pentateuch, 80, 90%, or in that, ballpark, in that realm, and is organized already in a way that looks roughly like our books of Moses, right? Our first five books. That's kind of what I think is there. And maybe as part of that, you do have this supplementary material from the Josephite perspective that's been integrated into those books, just as just as like Jeff Lindsay and Noel Reynolds have argued. Um, and then going beyond the Torah, strictly speaking, but it is worth noting. I quote Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman to the effect that It's only natural to assume there were northern prophets who were closer to the royal institutions of Samaria, and this kind of material could not possibly have entered the Bible as we know it today. That's a direct quote from their book, The Bible Unearthed, right? So prophets like Zenos and Zenock, right, could be on the brass plates because, and maybe that's why you have a Josephite lineage trying to preserve their own version of this stuff and putting it on metal even, right?
Yeah.
Because they see that as the editing and selective process that Hezekiah and his predecessors or his is it predecessors or the people who come after
Yeah.
him
Hmm.
they
I know
see
what you
that
meant.
they're omitting stuff that maybe is important to them still, right? And so they're like, okay, we want to make sure this all gets preserved. And so they've include some of this extra stuff, right?
Yeah. That's actually a really interesting point. The idea that um, the the texts that are most important to the Northern Kingdom and would be associated with their prophets that were living there close to their monarchy and so forth would be destroyed in the Assyrian uh, takeover. It would make sense why these brass plates are so heavily guarded and why they're seen as so valuable. Maybe these are one of the few records that has things about Zenos and Zenock and some of these other prophets on it that have survived. Maybe most of that's
Hmm.
gone at this point.
Hmm.
So that is an interesting point that until you brought that up, I hadn't really considered. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
I mean, you have I can't even remember where I saw it, but I just recently saw someone making a stink like, well, why did they have to get those brass plates? Why couldn't they just like find some scrolls, find some copies of this stuff somewhere else, whatever, and they where they didn't have to like have this confrontation with Laban and end up killing the guy, right? Like, but my assumption is that yeah, there's actually unique material that's being preserved only on these brass plates, as far as we know, and look, we haven't found it anywhere else to date, right? So that like there seems to be some unique material. It may be the only copies of some of this northern stuff that's survived. And again, uh, some of that survival may be because of yeah, it all got destroyed in Assyria. But I also assume that there's a sifting process here. Um, You've got prophets who are associated with the northern kingdom who are maybe painting a different picture than what kings from Judah want painted about either their own history or about the northern kingdom's history. Like, look, we're trying to integrate these people into who we are, but they're still the heretics, right? Like the northern kingdom is supposed to be the bad guys still. Um, and if you have prophets who are like Zenos and Zenock, who might have been like the Isaiah of the northern kingdom and are working closely with the kings of the north and are maybe giving prophecies that contradict what you get in as far as um, the perspective of southern prophets on different things, right? You're going to suppress those if you're integrating this source material into a corpus that's going to be preserved from a Judahite perspective, but you're trying to work in as much northern perspective as you can, something that comes into direct conflict with your southern prophets, you're probably going to suppress that. But maybe there's something, and we only have these little bits from Zenos and Zenock, so who knows? Maybe there's something in those northern prophets' writings that were important to these people who have those ties back to the northern kingdom, and they needed it for some reason or another.
yeah, um, yeah, and all this to say, like what we have today that we call the Hebrew Bible or the Pentateuch or Torah, if we want to be more specific. Um, these are shared cultural narratives between tribes and groups of people who considered themselves Israel. It's not till after the Pentateuch that we have a sort of a delineation between these are the writings of the southern tribes, these are the writings of northern tribes, or traditions, if you want to call them that. But all that we have today is a blending of those traditions and writings that have been preserved and filtered through the lens of the Southern Kingdom because that's who was left.
Hmm.
And so um, it's important, I think, to at least bring that up that as we're reading our Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament this year and Come Follow Me or whatever, and we're reading things in the Book of Mormon, uh, and the Book of Mormon, Nephi maybe quotes from somebody else that we're not familiar with in the Old Testament or something. Like there's some legitimate reasons for why there might be differences, and what we have preserved in our Old Testaments today, I feel very fortunate that we even have what we do. Um, are filtered through the lens of the Southern Kingdom
Yeah.
and its people, and so um, you always kind of have to have that in the back of your mind as you're reading, because you're going to read a lot in this year and Come Follow Me. We're going to read a lot about the Northern Kingdom's just messing up time and again, and the Southern Kingdom and its prophets are like they got to go do damage control and whatever. And there's a lot of back and forth uh and like you mentioned earlier, right? There's some sort of big brother little brother like battling going on at times where maybe
Hmm.
they're not on the same page, and so there's a lot there to take into consideration, I think, as we read through the Old Testament, as we have it today. um I did, if you'll humor me, I after reading your paper, I went through the Book of Mormon and I tried to find every reference I could, every quotation I could to something from the Torah, the Pentateuch.
Okay.
Um, and so I found this interesting. I'm not going to go through the whole list and quote a
I
bunch at
would
you.
I would appreciate it if you'd send it to me though. I'd love to have that as a resource.
It's rough notes. What I can do is why don't you give me some time? I'll actually write it out, and then I can just send you kind of a rough, Word doc or something.
Sure.
Um, but and I'm sure I will find a few more things along the way. This is only a couple hours worth of work here.
Sure.
Um, so nothing to write home about too much yet, but I went through and I broke it up between Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and tried to find instances in the Book of Mormon where they're either directly quoting from or referencing or possibly alluding to something from one of those five texts in the Pentateuch.
Hmm.
And I'll just point out a couple interesting things. Um, so when we talk about the brass plates carried by Nephi out of Jerusalem and with Lehi and their family out into the New World, it seems to be that the majority of the instances where the Book of Mormon references or quotes from or alludes to a idea or passage or phrase from the Pentateuch predominantly is found in First and Second Nephi
Hmm.
and Alma.
Hmm.
And if you remember, and a number of people have pointed this out, um, Alma the Younger really loves to harken back to Lehi. Um, he does it on multiple occasions where he will mention something about their father Lehi and the things that they were dealing with, and will be teaching some principle or something about. Um, for example, he'll mention something about um, the travails of Nephi and Lehi and their journey to the New World and so forth. And he does this a couple different times. So Alma the Younger seems to really have this sort of love for and appreciation for Lehi and Nephi. Um, so we do get a fair bit in Alma, the Book of Alma. But First and Second Nephi is where the majority of those references to the Pentateuch or the Torah exist.
Hmm.
We get a handful of them, and everybody who's listening, and Neal, you'll already recognize a number of these. Just kind of, if you take a second to think about it, you'll remember we have Adam and Eve mentioned in Second Nephi 2,
Hmm.
and elsewhere. We have allusions to the creation. Um, and what is interesting is to go back and talk about like the priestly Genesis account in Genesis 1 versus maybe a later or an earlier account with the Yahwist, to use the traditional documentary hypothesis model for
Hmm.
Genesis 2 and 3. It seems to be that there are passages in Second Nephi talking about Adam and Eve and their creation and so forth in the Garden of Eden that seem to be almost entirely like they're ripped out of Genesis 2 and 3, without any real allusion to Genesis 1.
Hmm.
But there are other portions of the Book of Mormon and in First Nephi and elsewhere that do seem to hint at something related more closely to Genesis 1. So that is there. Um, so there's some interesting things there. But just for Genesis, you have Second Nephi 2, Alma 12, Alma 42. Um, and by the way, a lot of these are references to creation, Adam and Eve, and so forth. Then we'll get to Exodus, and the Exodus narrative and Moses pops up all over the Book of Mormon.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
we hear the Exodus narrative repeated by many prophets in the Book of Mormon, and used differently at times, doing different things. So like Nephi, for example, in First Nephi 4 and First Nephi 17, and even like Alma will mention this in Alma 36, are talking about the Exodus through the Red Sea, the deliverance through the Red Sea. So that narrative is very strong in Nephi's view. And again, Alma is always constantly referring back to Lehi and Nephi. And so it's strong in his view in Alma 36 as well. Um, but what I did find interesting is the most common motif that is referenced in the Book of Mormon that harkens back to the Pentateuch is from Numbers and is Moses' raising of the brass serpent, the brazen serpent.
Yeah.
That is used more than anything else throughout the Book of Mormon as that sort of touch point, that reference point back to the Pentateuch. So I found that to be quite interesting. Um, then there are some interesting things here with respect to, if we want to talk about different layers or strata of the Pentateuch and how some of it seems to be much more um, priestly in nature, as delineating like rules and regulations and operations for sacrifices and offerings and Sabbaths and things of that nature. Um, there are a number of passages that do allude to like Numbers and Leviticus and stuff that are in Mosiah,
Mm.
First and Second Nephi, and a little bit in Alma, but then Helaman comes in, and you have a couple passages in Helaman, like Helaman 8, for example, and I lost my other reference, but there's a couple places in Helaman that will also reference like uh, covenant treaty law type things. Um, so you can even kind of uh, distinguish in the Book of Mormon which passages are being used to tell a historical narrative versus
Yeah.
which passages are referring to or alluding to sort of covenant treaty type things, policy type
Hmm.
things, priestly sacrifice type things. So you can even divide it up by that. But uh, you know, 30,000 view here is the majority of passages in the Book of Mormon that allude to the Pentateuch or the Torah seem to be in First, Second Nephi, and Alma, predominantly, which would make sense because they immediately have the brass plates in front of them,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so forth, and then you do have like Mosiah who carries the records and so forth. But
Well,
I found that
that's
interesting.
that's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, uh, well, just another plug for some of my other work, the Brazen Serpent. I actually have a whole paper on that in the Book of Mormon, Serpents of Fire and Brass, published with Interpreter. So if someone wants to check that out, and yes, that is absolutely a pre-exilic narrative, by the way. That's something I looked into when I wrote that paper. So um, uh, I think what's part of what's interesting about that though, is not only because like Lehi and Nephi they get the plates, and so yeah, it makes sense that they would refer to it a lot. But it also makes sense because the purpose to which Nephi is writing his narrative in First and Second Nephi, he tells us, right, that it comes right after he's split from his brothers, and he's already written an account that he started back in, it sounds like from the narrative that we have around First Nephi 19, it sounds like he found ore and started working on his first account that's the large plates, sometime shortly after they arrive in the New World. But then he's writing this account shortly after he splits from his brothers and they have to go up to the land of Nephi. And he's trying to create there's a political purpose to which he's doing this, and that's to create a narrative that uh, justifies or um, explains why people should follow him as the proper heir to Lehi and his leadership than over and above Laman and Lemuel and their competing claim there, right? And what's interesting about that is that seems to kind of be the purpose of Genesis too, right? In fact, I was just reading just before we started this. I mentioned I was reading Gary Rensburg and his view, and he's kind of arguing that, like, well, one of the problems that David is going to deal with in his reign, and even Solomon as the successor, is that they're younger sons of their fathers, right? And so how do you justify that and whatnot? Well, you tell a national origin story where over and over again it's the younger son who is being favored, right?
Yeah, it's
And
Jacob,
that's
it's Joseph. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so you have, but you have Nephi's in the same situation that David is in, or Solomon, or pick your king, or even Hezekiah, right? As he's trying to integrate these people in, like he's trying to create a new identity and a new national people in a certain respect, right? And Brant Gardner has characterized it as it's an act of ethnogenesis, right? He's trying to create a Nephite identity in these narratives, and so it makes a lot of sense that as he's doing that, he's hearkening back and drawing on extensively the ethnogenesis narrative of the Israelites, which is going to be your Genesis and Exodus narrative, basically, right? So, no surprises there that is where you get a heavy dose of stuff referring back to those narratives, I feel like. Um, Mosiah, I don't know how much you were factoring in arguments about things um, like the festivals and things like that,
Yeah,
like
Sukkot and
Sukkot, like Benjamin being an implementation of Sukkot and stuff like that. But it makes sense. Again, you mentioned Mosiah. I think you said that's where you see a lot of Leviticus showing up, and that makes a lot of
yeah.
sense, given that we have these festivals that are being incorporated into the narrative right at that point. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and that's why, like I said, I'd love to get a copy of that. Um, this is something, like I said, this whole paper really for me is kind of a preliminary thing. I have I don't know if when I'll get around to doing more of it because I seem to get roped into or dragged into Arabian studies stuff over and over again and Lehi's Trail quite a lot. But um, I have the ambition of doing something a little more expansive with trying to understand what material, not only what material was on the brass plates, but how it factors into at various points into the Book of Mormon narrative, and how we can actually maybe study the contents of the brass plates through like the Book of Mormon as like a layer, right, that you have to get past to then look at what's on the brass plates and how it's being used by the Nephites. So but that's who knows if and when that'll ever happen. So it's on my project to-do list. I think you know Spencer Krause. I've talked
Oh
to him
yeah.
about doing it together. But yeah,
Yeah, you need
this
to go
is
knock on Spencer's door and tell him he needs to get off his butt and come join me and Alan some more in our Hebrew Bible study.
well, I'm sure he would love to. I will tell him that. Anyway.
No, I know he's busy. I know you guys are busy. You've recently worked on a paper together or are working on a paper together.
Yeah, I mean it's in peer review right now, so we'll see what comes back and what we need to do on it. But yeah, we it's he did I'm not joking when I say he did 99% of the work. The only claim I have to working on it with him is it was my idea in the first place. And we did meet regularly, and I gave him, I told him what I think and what to incorporate, and I gave him sources to look up and stuff like that. But I was busy writing two other papers at the same time. So, um, but yeah, we just recently did a paper on, we're working on this paper for the interpreter conference coming up on the Isaiah material. It's kind of a continuation of this brass plates theme, right? Because it's on the Isaiah material in the Book of Mormon, and when does it date? Does it is it pre-exilic or not, right? And can we actually explain all of that material existing on the brass plates? So I don't know. I guess I'm maybe making my case to not just be an Arabian guy. I'm a brass plates guy too now. So
Well, I'd love to see some more on that as well. I mean, I look forward to see what you and Spencer have been working on with Isaiah in the Book of Mormon as well. It's been a pleasure having you talk about your paper and just come nerd out with me. And uh, I've had the privilege of having Steven on the channel back when he and Brian Passantino had done their volume on Joseph Smith's uncanonized revelations.
yeah.
Your wife Jasmine has been very gracious and has joined me on the channel on a number of occasions, which has been really cool. So it was really only a matter of time, Neal, before you completed my Informed Saints bingo card.
Your Informed Saints bingo. There you go. That should
So
be the intro to this video.